Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to view Smallville Season 1, Episodes 7 and 8. So, for the titles of these episodes, we of course have in Episode 7, we have an episode called Cravings, which is unusual. But then we also have Jitters, which is also an unusual title. So, but not only an unusual title for these episodes, but we also, of course, have unusual powers that go into the villains per these episodes. So, immediately I have to go on and say that Jody has a very heartbreaking story, the villain in this story. But not only that, I do kind of feel that Jody has fairly similar powers to, of course, Sean from episodes before. And so Jody's powers, of course, are to be that Jody was to have gone on and gotten these plants from her Melville nurturing greenhouse to then go on and consume these plants by going on and blending them up into a shake to then somehow be able to become thinner, but at a cost of needing to go on and consume hefty amounts of food, realizing that that doesn't quite do. And then Jody goes on and literally sucks the fat out of everybody. And so that was a very unusual story and a heartbreaking kind of episode. And so, like, I feel horrible having to, like, praise episode 7. I like the risk that they took. I think there was some interesting takeaways from the episode. But overall, I feel at least that episode 7 feels better than episode 6 in some ways. There was just some interesting stuff, even CGI'd things eventually where Jody had to like very stretch out her like her mouth was like, wow, this is really interesting. So in episode 8 we have a guy named Earl who a lot of people know from the movie Candyman and a number of other things. So we of course have Earl, who is to horribly have these seizures slash shakes, and Earl is to desperately want to go on and find Lionel Luthor, hoping that somehow Earl will be taken to the level 3 of this fertilizing plant and eventually find out what had poisoned him to reverse this whole process. And come to find out, the only person who is to know that there is a level 3 within this fertilizing plant is Earl and Earl alone, because no one else is to go on and admit that there was a level 3 or that they even know that it exists. So we of course had the very interesting part towards the end of this story where it seems that even Lionel is to realize that his own son can really just be expendable. And we have the moment where Lex is hugging Lionel, looking back at Clark and his family, like going like, oh man, like Clark is getting all kinds of praise, and like and this seems to be a loving family, where Lex is looking on as his father is just to be like just kind of doing this kind of fake kind of hug and whatever, because like the cameras are there and he has to go on and put on this performance of this loving father, when really he sent off his son to death without a second thought about it. It seems through the eyes of the viewer, and so on and so forth. who is me. So, going on to these episodes, we also have Dr. Stephen Hamilton, who eventually will become a big part of this show, to eventually have Hamilton go and help us discover the cave eventually somewhere down the road within these episodes. And then eventually this guy will at some point just vanish, to have him be brought back later on. And eventually that story will possibly tie in Pete. So that's kind of interesting. Not only that, we have episode 7, where if Chloe was to go on and have a date with Sean in the past, now we have Pete getting an opportunity to him possibly having his own date. So I thought that was really cool. I really enjoyed that. I liked that. So with that said, it was also kind of funny consistently still watching the Talkville podcast episodes, where both Tom and Michael are going on and talking about these episodes, because of course I was to see certain moments where Michael was to have a joke with Tom about certain things that they were to go on and say. The one thing that I guess I realized that I forgot about is the one moment where we have the one girl who ends up morphing into other characters. I ended up forgetting that her mother was to be like thrown down this flight of stairs and killed. And I guess that was one thing that I forgot about. But yeah, eventually I'm sure there was probably a number of things that were like, oh yeah, I forgot about this, or oh, I forgot about that, because doing 2 episodes in one fell swoop of a thing, I'm sure there's a number of things that I've probably forgotten about. There's also the moment where uh, Lex and Clark were talking about the whole, like, a real smart guy would wear a mask. Anyways, so, but anyway, let's go on and let's talk about these episodes, episode 7 and 8, and let's go on into that double 5 time territory. Let's just go into spoilers. This show is still available on Hulu for those of you that want to go on and check it out, because it is about that time to just go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time I get to get spoil this episode. So we go on, and in the beginning of this episode, we have Melville's nursing greenhouse, where we of course have Jody, who is going on and pulling these plants to eventually go on and make a shake out of them, hoping that she'll be able to lose weight, because Jody of course can no longer wait to figure out how she can possibly lose weight, so she's going to go on and just take drastic measures and eventually do these shakes. Whereas her father is telling her, it's like, no, hey, like, I think you're fine. If anything, I think you also need to go on and, like, you really need to go and eat some normal food. And Jody's like, no, I think I can go on and take these shakes and I'll be fine. And her father's just like, well, okay, all right. Like, so we go on and we have Jody, who is to go on to school to then talk to Chloe and Pete, and all of a sudden, while they are to be talking about things, mentioning about, I believe, Lana's birthday, because that seems to be the focus of this episode. And eventually we have Jody, who is to go on with Pete to have them go to Lana's birthday party together, as if this is some kind of date, which that was fairly cool. So, but we'll get to that. So we of course have Jody, who's talking to Pete and Chloe here, and all of a sudden Dustin starts walking through with this basketball, and all of a sudden after they are to have this kind of dialogue together where Dustin is to kind of rag on uh, Jody and Pete is to go on and try to eventually uh, have certain words to start talking here. All of a sudden, Dustin is to bounce this basketball, and we all of a sudden have Jody's shake that ends up kind of going all over her, and now Jody is to go on to try to clean herself off. So we go on and have Whitney and Lana, and so Whitney is to mention that he is to go off to do this tryout, I believe, for the Sharks. I believe from episodes before we had like a reference of that, but I think it's now actually happening. So Whitney, I guess, will be gone directly on the same day that Lana's birthday is, and so eventually Whitney is to go on and give Lana this book, so that way at least he will have a present for her. So it seems that Lana is to be very overwhelmed by Nell wanting to go on and give Lana like the perfect birthday party, to where it seems that Nell is sparing no expense, like asking Lana like, well, hey, what balloons do you want? What kind of what kind of birthday do you want? What kind of this? What kind of that? To the point where Lana's birthday is to be celebrated into the Luther mansion, and they're having this whole big party, and Lex, of course, is easily wanting to welcome Lana in to this party, and so on and so forth. So it seems that Lana is to consistently have Nell like uh, asking her so many questions about this party, to the point of Lana going on and just being so like exhausted from all of the questions. So Lana even has at one point in this episode sneaks away to talk to Martha about the whole grocery list for this party, and eventually is to talk to Clark, and Clark to say, it's like, well, hey, I guess if you're gonna go on and fly solo on at your birthday party, like, how about I come in there and I I end up being like your bodyguard for all your adoring fans. And it's like, wait a minute, since when is Lana all of a sudden this big massive celebrity? That all of a sudden Clark has to perform these like bodyguard like duties. It's very weird, it's very unusual, but like, I guess also when looking at it, it seems that Lana is to always have these obsessed friends that are to go on and go a little bit too far with liking Lana anyways. Cue up any number of villains that we've already had through these episodes regardless. So we go on and we have Jody, who is to realize that somehow she is starting to become thin. Here's the goofy thing though. We have at some points where I think that this episode doesn't really quite understand when Jody should have these prosthetics on and when she shouldn't, because she should be looking thinner. Because at some points we have it where Jody is thin, but then we see her like X number of scenes afterwards, and then all of a sudden, like, it seems that she has this full prosthetic on, and it's like, wait a minute, like, I thought she was just than before. Like, where, like, this is some kind of weird yo-yoing effect going on here, and not much of that is really explained. So, but we have Jody that is to look on at the scale, and it seems that this girl is to only weigh, like, supposedly, like, 160 some odd pounds, it seems, and then eventually, when she starts to become even thinner, she's like 140. I'm like, man, she's gonna get to the point where she's like severely skinny, and I don't understand how is it that she looks so like thick in the cheeks with her being only 160 some odd pounds. It doesn't make sense to me. Um, unless this girl is just very short. I don't know. I don't know how exactly, uh, with the weight on the scale, like we have like the facial features and stuff like that that makes this person seem way larger, um, than the weight that is to be presented here. I'm a little baffled and confused, but it is what it is. So once Jodie is to realize that she is to become thin, we go on and have her also, start to really, um, become hungry and start to raid her fridge. It seems that her father, who is, Mr. Melville, is to possibly be going out of town soon, and so Mr. Melville is to go on and tell Jody that maybe, they should go on and see like a doctor or shrink or something, to help Jody maybe feel better about her body. And Jody's like, no, like I'm fine, like I'm perfectly fine. As Jody, of course, is to be thinner now that she's gone on and eaten a bunch of things. So we go on and we have Lex in this episode, who is to make his way to the torch, to go on and talk to Clark, because it seems that, Lex is to make his way into the torch to, look upon the Wall of Weird, and we have Lex explaining the whole meteor shower thing, where Lex was to, of course, lose the ability to grow hair, and so on and so forth, and where he was when the meteor shower happened. And we, of course, have Clark who's going on and saying, like, Lex, like, oh, I didn't know. Like, so we also have Lex, who I believe in these episodes is going through a health checkup as he's running on this treadmill, and we have this doctor who, is looking at, uh, Lex and possibly saying that he may be ill or he may be sick of some kind, and Lex is to go on and just be like, no, like I think I'm perfectly fine, and I'm sick of all these tests being run or ran. So, anyways, we go on to eventually have Lana, who is to see, things being prepared for her birthday party, and Lex is to talk, to Lana about her birthday party and how Lex is to, of course, really like the fact that, Clark is to, of course, be Lana's chaperone, and so on and so forth to this party. And Lana's just like, well, yeah, like we'll see, because of course Lana was to tell Clark, after Clark asked, like, well, hey, I can be your chaperone, and Lana is to tell Clark, it's like, well, yeah, but like, hopefully you'll be here this time around. Like, hopefully you'll go on and you'll be here, when I need you to. Hence why eventually, Lana is to be more appreciative of Whitney, because Whitney somehow or another is to always technically be there. So we go on and have, of course, uh, Jody, who can no longer go on and just use food to eventually prevent her growling stomach from happening. And so eventually Jody is now forced to find someone to suck the fat out of. And so eventually the first person that she is decided to bump into and want to consume the fat out of is, of course, this school's bully, who is to be Dustin. And since all of a sudden Jody is to be much thinner, Dustin is to find Jody much more appealing. And I'm like, yeah, of course, of course. What a douchebaggery like thing to do. And like, of course, we just have this guy who has to be the villain of this episode, even much more so than Jody is. So, like, maybe, yeah, maybe I can go on and just say, sadly enough, the guy who plays Dustin is much more the villain of this story than anyone else is, and he deserves what he ends up getting in this episode, sadly enough. So, we go on to have Jody take Dustin, I think, to this like boiler room in this school, and she just sucks the life out of him. And all of a sudden, Clark is to go on and find Dustin, uh, who is to be, of course, much more thinner than he was before. And Clark is to go on and discuss this with Chloe and figure out that somehow or another it must be Jody who is to be the only one who is to be doing this somehow or another. So we then go on and because the one thing that I probably have forgotten about these episodes is eventually we have like either Clark and Pete and Chloe like kind of figuring out uh, how these villains are to possibly get their powers in these episodes. That's the one thing that I kind of forget about. But anyways, that's what tends to happen in these episodes. So we of course have Clark who's realizing that Pete may be in danger, as of course Pete had gone on to meet up with Jody, and it seems that Pete was very much a loss for words when possibly having Jody saying like, well, hey, maybe me and Pete can go together to Lana's birthday party. And Pete, of course, is just like, and Clark was, of course, answering for Pete, saying like, yeah, I think Pete will like that. And Sam or Pete continues to go on like, and so we go on and have Pete, who is to go and pick up Jody and eventually give her these nice flowers, and eventually uh, go on to eventually have her stomach starting to growl. Before Jody was to even consume Dustin, we also had the moment in this episode where Jody was to accidentally hit a deer with her car, and she was to consume this deer. And so Chloe and Clark were to, of course, go on and take pictures of this deer because it had such an unusual thing about it. And Chloe was to say, it's like, well, hey, Clark, if you go on and you take pictures of this deer, like, I'll go on and I'll help you with figuring out a birthday gift for Lana, because Clark is like, well, I don't know what to really give her. And so eventually a conversation between Clark and Lana helped Clark figure out what to do to give a gift for Lana, which of course Lana is to mention about one time that she was to be with her parents and was to go to the drive-in, see this certain movie with these certain cartoons, and Lana was to feel very comforted, even though she fell asleep and didn't actually have the ability to see the movie still. So, but anyways, Clark is to run off to realize that Pete is in jeopardy and to try to rescue him, as of course we go on and have Pete, who ended up getting knocked out uh, by Jody, and eventually, when it seems close that Pete is going to get killed off here, we have Clark, who ends up going on and saving Jody, and eventually having both Clark and Jody fighting it out in this greenhouse. And so eventually what happens is that when Clark is to make it in this greenhouse, he is to realize that there are certain things in there that are to be uh, with kryptonite within them, and Clark is to start to feel weak and start to stumble. Jody is to take Clark out with this shovel, but then eventually he starts to break this glass and is to realize by looking at this glass that she doesn't like what she sees and that she still thinks of herself as ugly. And so she decides to start breaking things in here to possibly take herself down. And that all of a sudden leads to this explosion in this greenhouse. But Clark is to luckily save both himself and Chloe to eventually take Chloe out of this greenhouse to then wave Pete over, who comes to, and they go on and eventually get Jody some medical attention and tell everybody what had happened. So, interestingly enough, when Clark is to finally arrive after far too late of this party going on and being over and everything like that, Clark is to still want to give Lana her birthday present regardless of him not being able to make it to this party. And so eventually that present is the story that Lana gave Clark about the whole movie. And so it seems Clark figured out a way to track down this movie and is to make his own makeshift kind of drive-in thing for Lana and Clark to both watch this movie together. And like, what a kind of really nice ending to this episode, and I really enjoyed it. A much better ending than a lot of other goofy, weird endings where we have both Clark and Lana who are shouting out to the heavens, or whatever other things that they had them kind of do at certain other ends of other episodes. So we go on into episode 8. So in episode 8, we of course go on to have Clark be helping out his parents with certain chores while eating a certain thing of food. So we go on and we have Jonathan, who is telling Clark that he's going to up Clark's allowance and so on and so forth. So that's kind of like some fun moments. We also find out, like, if the last episode wasn't to be like this special holiday, come to find out it is also to be Martha and Jonathan's anniversary of them being together. And so we have Clark, who is to go on and give his mother and father a card. Reminding them that, like, hey, yeah, like, this is your anniversary. And of course we have Martha and we have Jonathan, who's saying that they're going to be out of town for a number of days to go to Metropolis to kind of go on and do something and fun and adventurous for them. And Clark is going to fully take advantage of that by having a party. So now let's go on and focus on a guy named Earl. So Earl, of course, to go on to make his way back to his home, where we have Earl, who is looking at the like his baby, as I guess Earl had sneaked into this home and is seeing his wife at this crib checking on their child, and then Earl checks on his baby, and he is to start to notice that he is starting to shake. So Earl had lost everything. He had lost his marriage, he had lost his child, he had lost his job via him getting these powers from the fertilizing plant. We also, in episode 7, and here's what I forgot about, but I'll insert this here. We had Dr. Stephen Hamilton that I kind of mentioned briefly. In episode 7, he, of course, was to go on and be introduced to Lex Luthor, who Lex, of course, was to become fairly interested in these meteor rocks and was to talk to Hamilton that there may be somehow a cure to Lex's illness that he is to somehow have, and there may be a solution via these meteor rocks. And so Lex is to want to go on and fund Dr. Stephen Hamilton, but of course Hamilton has no real interest. Come to find out, Lex is to poke around and find out that Hamilton, of course, was to have an affair with certain students at his school. And so eventually Lex uses that as a way to force Hamilton to want to work with him and eventually fund him. And so, like, that story will continue on in other episodes, which won't be the 8th episode. So, anyways, we go on and we have Earl, who is to make his way to LexCorp to try and go on to talk to Lionel Luthor, but sadly enough, Earl is to only meet a guy named Will, who is to be this kind of night buffer guy that is to kind of buff these floors. Earl is to be desperately banging upon this door to want to talk to Will, hoping that will lead to Earl seeing Lionel, but that just won't happen. So Will, of course, to go on and notice that Earl is to have this shaking power that is to break this door, and Will is like, oh my god, Earl, like, what had happened to you? And so Earl is to tell Will that Lionel is the only one who knows about his illness, and he needs to go back to level 3 of the fertilizing plant. And so all of a sudden Earl again is to start having these shakes, and eventually Earl shakes so hard that it ends up accidentally killing Will in the process, and then eventually Earl is to sneak away, realizing that he might have accidentally killed somebody, and so he runs off, and Will is now dead there. So we then go on to, of course, have... let me pause here for 1 second. Alright. So, now we, of course, have Clark, who is, to, of course, do a rebellious thing by having a party. Clark, of course, to tell the people that he wanted a very small party, but that doesn't really happen that way. We, of course, have Clark, who is to have to manage to use his super speed to find a bowl, because one of the teens is to get far too drunk and want to hurl. So Clark ends up using his super speed to eventually prevent a guy from barfing in his home. And we, of course, have Clark, who's to mention that things are starting to break within his home, within this party. So Clark is going on and talking to Chloe, and is to kind of go on and like talk about things. And we also have Lana that is to make her way to this party, and it seems that there is some friction going on between both Lana and both Whitney, because Whitney is to arrive at this party and is to be upset that Lana is to also be there, because this, of course, is Clark's party. And so we have, of course, Clark, who seems to be managing this party well, and we also have Lex, who is to pitch in for this party also by shooting off a bunch of fireworks. We have a really smart thing where Lex is to go on and tell Clark, hey, yeah, like, I talked to everybody around, and like, nobody's gonna call the police or anything. You're perfectly fine. Go ahead and like shoot these fireworks off, because I've kind of greased the wheels of everybody to have it be perfectly okay that all these fireworks are being shot off. And I'm like, wow, that's actually like really like some smart, like, there's so much about this episode that kind of does feel actually fairly like intelligent or common like sense stuff, where it's all of a sudden they're like rationalizing. It's like, oh yeah, like Lex was to go on and kind of grease the palms of a bunch of people to have Clark be able to shoot off these fireworks without anybody calling the cops on them. So we go on to, of course, have Whitney and Lana, who are talking in the barn about their relationship, and all of a sudden they end up getting spooked by somebody within this barn who is shaking far too much, which of course is Earl. Whitney is to tell Clark that Earl is to be in this barn, and so Clark and Whitney are to have like this pitchfork and so on and so forth, thinking that this may be some weird animal of sorts. So Clark is to uncover that this is Earl, and then Earl explains that Earl needs Jonathan's help to hope that Jonathan is going to get to the bottom of what had happened to Earl, because Earl, of course, is very sick. And of course, we come to find out that Clark was to have a past with Earl, that I guess in the past, Earl had worked on the farm with Jonathan and with Clark. We also had an interesting moment in episode 7 where Clark was to eventually talk to both Jonathan and Martha about him being able to put this like certain wooden piece down to the ground, and all of a sudden Lana is overhearing this, and then Clark has to go on and mention that he's like, oh, I just used a sledgehammer to get through to be able to put this wooden post down, and Lana's like, oh, okay, all right. So I thought that was kind of funny. So we have Clark that brings Earl to this hospital to hope that he gets like the care that he needs, and eventually when Clark ends up getting back home, he realizes that he needs to quickly go on and fix up the whole entire house after this party. But it seems that both Jonathan and Martha are to make it back home early, because of course they were to have called this house numerous times to come and find out every single time somebody else answered who wasn't Clark, and they didn't even know who Clark really was. So we have Clark, who of course is busted, but it didn't seem like he was grounded. So Clark goes on and explains to Jonathan and Martha what had all happened with Earl. And so Jonathan and Clark are to make their way to the hospital to see Earl. And we, of course, have Clark that explains to Jonathan that that Clark feels that he cannot go and actually see Earl because it seems that Clark should have some kind of reaction to Earl that is to be similar to the reaction of kryptonite, and that it's possible that being closer to Earl would make Clark sick. So Jonathan goes into the room and has Earl explain everything to Jonathan, and so eventually Jonathan is to just say it's like, well, I think that he just needs to rest. Like, I think that's all he really needs. The doctor goes on and explains to Jonathan and Clark that this guy is to go on and have seizures and that he is just very sick and that they can't figure out what is wrong with him. And Earl, of course, who has gone through a number of doctors, is to come to the same conclusion that nobody could figure out how to help him. So we go on to have Clark, who is to tell Jonathan that there's a possibility that, of course, Clark is to go on to this fertilizing plant as a field trip, and that he could maybe be able to snoop around there and figure out some answers. And Jonathan's like, well, I don't know about that, like putting Clark kind of at risk, but also Clark is just like, no, I'm willing to kind of go on and kind of figure this all out. So we go on and we have Clark, who is to go on to this field trip, and it seems that also Earl is to want to make his way to this fertilizing plant also, to hope that he can come up with answers also, because we had Clark that was kind of we have Earl who is eavesdropping on both Jonathan and Clark's conversation through his little microphone thing, and so on and so forth. So, and we also have Earl, who was to go into this elevator and shake his way to get out of his cuffs and to knock out this police officer to try and escape from this hospital anyways. So we make our way to have Clark going on this field trip to eventually be toured around by Gabe Sullivan, who of course is Chloe's father. So we have Gabe that is going on to have all these kind of crap jokes or all these kind of goofy, silly jokes. And Chloe is to mention to her friends that it's like, oh, well, like, my father's really respected in his field and so on and so forth, trying to have Chloe trying to justify that her father is way more important that he is to really give off here. So we eventually have this field trip being halted by Earl going and finding Gabe after, of course, Earl can not find the elevator that leads to level 3 because the room that has the elevator in it is oddly sealed. And now Earl is fairly upset to the point of him hijacking this field trip to then now grab Gabe and to tell him, like, take me to level 3, take me to this level. So we go on and have Clark, who's investigating all around this facility, to eventually realize that now Earl is to be holding people hostage. We go on and have Clark, who is to eventually come into this room where Earl is at, to eventually convince him that this level 3 does not exist, because Clark is to have blueprints to this building, and there is no level 3 within this blueprint, convincing Earl that possibly level 3 might all just be in his mind. So eventually Earl is to shake this certain lever to eventually start to have this methane gas start to fill this facility. So now it seems there really is some danger afoot here. And we, of course, have Lionel and Lex, who are to go on and make their way to this facility to try to see if they can negotiate their way to solving all this. As well as we also have Martha and Jonathan that are to go on and see hopefully what is to go on here within this whole negotiation of things, because of course their son is to be involved in this whole field trip. So we go to have Lionel not really wanting to go on and reveal to Earl that there's a level 3 or anything of that nature. So Lex has decided that he wants to go on in there himself and negotiate with Earl if it means he lets all the hostages go. So we have Lionel kind of stepping in and wanting to be a father and say, like, Lex, no, you can't go in there. And Lex is like, well, hey, if you're not going to go in there, then I am. So Lex goes in there and gets a bulletproof vest to eventually talk Earl down. And so Lex's bargaining chip is for every single person to go free, and Lex will take Earl to level 3. So we of course have Clark, who's asking Lex, it's like, well, do you really think that you can find level 3? And Lex is like no, because level 3 is only in Earl's imagination. It's not a real place. So we go on and seem to have all the hostages that are leaving, and we have Clark then ends up staying back into this facility, and he wants to go on and figure things out. We have Pete, who goes outside of this facility to talk to Jonathan and talks to Martha and tells them that he's sorry, he's so sorry, and that Clark is still inside. We kind of have Pete, who has this kind of very weird line delivery here when he's talking to both Jonathan and Martha. I kind of laughed at it a little bit, but anyways. But it's like, it's hard for anybody to go on and deliver lines in a show. Like, really looking at it, there's probably several amounts of times where anybody can go on and have these moments of laughter and so on and so forth about certain things that they have to go on and say for the show. And it really doesn't come down to the person delivering it. It's just has like it be that certain people have to deliver lines that just really don't sound right. But they have to figure out a way to sell it. So it's probably not Pete at all. It's probably just whatever line he was to be given that day just sounded weird. But anyways, so we have Lex and we have Earl who are making their way through this facility. And so Clark is to go on and use his X-ray vision to figure out where the level 3 really is. And so eventually he goes on and finds that and is to destroy this brick wall to then show this elevator shaft for Earl and Lex to go in there. Clark is to go through this kind of PA system to tell Earl that, hey, like, I found the elevator, like, go into this elevator so you can get to level 3. So Earl and Lex go into this elevator and come to find out that there is only 2 stories, and Lex is to bring up that point. And Earl goes on and hits this black button, and it takes them to level 3. So Lex and Earl go on to eventually find that the entire level 3 is somehow now empty, and Earl is like, God, I'm never going to be able to figure out what happened to me, and I'm going to die because I'm not going to be able to figure this out. So all of a sudden we go on and we start to have Earl, who is starting to shake upon this platform that they are on, and all of a sudden the platform breaks, and now Clark is to run to find both Earl and both Lex and try to rescue them from falling to certain death. So Clark is to somehow be able, with his super strength, to lift up Earl, and when lifting up Earl is to be able to have Lex get a grab onto this platform, because of course before Lex was only holding on to Earl's legs for him fearing of falling to his death. So Clark is to then go on and grab Lex and try to retrieve him, and all of a sudden we find that Earl again is to have these horrible shakes and is to cause possibly this whole entire platform to collapse. Lex and Clark run and eventually tackle Earl into the elevator to go on and subdue him. And so what ends up happening is that Lionel is eventually talking to Lex, and Lex is still kind of holding a grudge with his father. Say it's like, well, yeah, like you couldn't have gone in there and just shown him where the level 3 is, because level 3 obviously existed. And all of a sudden we then have Lionel that's like, well, hey, like plausible deniability, like I just wanted to eventually tell Earl like what he needed to hear, kind of thing. So ever the kind of person who is to kind of warp the way of talking to fit what Lionel was connivingly trying to do, even though again I still always thoroughly just enjoy Lionel. But so we have Lionel who goes on and hugs Lex, and Lex is to look on as Clark is to be like hugged and high-fived and whatever by his parents, and Lex is just going like I want that kind of family, but of course he can't get it. We also have in episode 7 where Lex is to actually talk about his mother, which I think in future episodes we will actually see a lot more of Lex's mother, and eventually hear that Lex at some point is to have a brother. So, because we go on into this episode, in episode 7, and have Lex talk about that his mother wanted him to go on and spend some time with Lionel, and so eventually we'll start to see Lex's family somewhere down the road more, and that'll be some fascinating stories. So with that said, I think I'm going to go on and try to get out of here to call this a day. So goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Let me know in the comments below if there's anything that I forgot about, because I'm sure that there probably is. Let me know how you felt about these episodes, whether you liked them, whether you hated them, whether you felt indifferent about them, because that's a possibility also. let me know how you've felt about this season so far, whether you are to, of course, gone on and maybe you liked the later episodes. Maybe season 1 is your favorite season for whatever reason. Let me know in the comments below, because either way, comments are always great. It's really helpful. So, with that said, I'm going to go on and get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.